In April of 2004, in a small apartment in Melbourne, Australia, a 45-year-old woman named Rhonda Byrne sat down on the floor of her bedroom and started reading a yellowed paperback her daughter had handed her a few hours earlier. The book had been written 94 years before. The man who wrote it had been dead for 93 of those years. He died poor at 51 in a small town in Indiana that almost no one has ever heard of. What Rhonda did over the next 3 years would gross hundreds of millions of dollars. And the strange thing, the part of her story almost no one tells, is that she didn't just read the book. She did exactly what it told her to do. Hold that image for a minute. A grown woman sitting on the floor of her own bedroom in the worst year of her life, reading a book older than her grandmother, crying on and off, underlining things in pencil, folding down the corners of pages, whatever was wrong in her life that month. And almost everything in her life was wrong that month. This book had her attention in a way nothing else had had it in years. By the end of this video, we're going back to that bedroom, and you're going to see exactly what was on those pages that changed everything for her. And maybe for you too. But first, you need to understand something strange about this particular book. It's only about 100 pages long. The print is small. The cover is plain. It was written in 1910 by a man named Wattles, a small-town American teacher and lecturer who had spent most of his life broke. He had failed at farming. He had failed at preaching. He had failed at a half-dozen other things by the time he sat down to write this book, and he wrote it in the last full year of his life. He never made any real money from it. He died in obscurity, in a town in Tennessee, and was buried in a small Indiana cemetery that hardly anyone visits, even now. And for 90 years after he died, the book just sat there, on bookshelves, in libraries, in used bookstores. Most people had never heard of it. The ones who had mostly didn't talk about it, but something kept happening. Every couple of decades, somebody would pick the book up, somebody desperate, somebody at the end of something, somebody who had nothing left to try, and they would read it, and they would actually do what it told them to do, and their lives would change in ways they couldn't always explain. Napoleon Hill read it. Years later, he wrote Think and Grow Rich, the book that has now sold over 100 million copies, and many of its central ideas trace directly back to Wattles. Earl Nightingale read it. He turned the same central idea Wattles had written about half a century earlier into the first spoken word recording in history to sell over 1 million copies. He called it The Strangest Secret, and in 2004, in that Melbourne bedroom, Rhonda Byrne read it, and what she did with it would become the biggest self-help phenomenon of the 21st century. And you've almost certainly heard of it, even if you've never heard her name. But to understand what Rhonda actually did, to understand why this strange little book keeps doing this to people, more than a century after the man who wrote it died, I want to start somewhere else completely. 6 years before Rhonda Byrne ever picked up that book, with a young woman in Atlanta who had never heard of Wallace Wattles in her life, and who, without knowing it, was about to do almost everything his book said to do. It's 1998, Atlanta, Georgia, late summer, the kind of heat that makes the asphalt shimmer in the parking lots, the kind that fills your car the second you open the door. A 27-year-old woman named Sarah Blakely is getting ready for a party. She's standing in front of the mirror in her small apartment, and she has on a brand new pair of cream-colored slacks, and she has a problem. The pants look terrible, or rather, they look fine, but underneath them the line of her underwear is showing through. The fabric is bunching at the waist, and the only thing in her closet that would smooth all that out is a pair of control-top pantyhose, which would also work, except for the fact that she's wearing open-toed sandals to the party, which means the toes of the pantyhose are going to stick out the front of her sandals. So Sarah sits down on the edge of her bed. She picks up a pair of fabric scissors from her dresser drawer, And, almost without thinking about it, she cuts the feet off the pantyhose. She puts them on. She looks in the mirror. The pants look perfect. The pantyhose stay up, barely, but they stay up. And as she's standing there in front of her own reflection, she has a thought. Not a business thought. Not a this is an idea thought. Just a small, ordinary, almost annoyed thought. Why doesn't this exist as a product? You have to understand who Sarah Blakely is at this exact moment. She has no fashion industry experience. She's never sewn a piece of clothing in her life. She has no business degree, no investors, no mentors. She doesn't know a single person in the textile world. What she does have is $5,000 in her bank account, the entire amount of her savings, and a job selling fax machines door to door for a company called Danker. She's been the top salesperson in her region for years, but the kind of top salesperson who has been getting doors slammed in her face every single day for 7 years. Sarah Blakely is, by every external measure, a fax machine salesperson. That's the job. That's the trajectory. That's the life on paper. Her parents are kind, supportive people who would have loved her if she had stayed a fax machine salesperson the rest of her life. Nobody in her circle was telling her she was meant for more than this. Sarah herself didn't really know what she was about to do, but the next morning, a Saturday, she sits down at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and she starts writing. What she writes isn't a business plan. She doesn't know what a business plan looks like. What she writes is a description of what she wants, what the product looks like, what it feels like in your hands, what it does, what kind of woman wears it, how that woman feels about herself when she puts it on and looks in the mirror. And then at the very top of the page, she writes one sentence. This product is going to be on Oprah's favorite things. In 1998, Oprah Winfrey's favorite things was the single most powerful endorsement in American consumer culture. A product that made that list could go from invisible to sold out in 48 hours. It was the closest thing to economic magic that existed in the country. Sarah Blakely had no product. She had no company. She had no industry contacts. What she had was a pair of cut-up pantyhose on her bedroom floor and a yellow legal pad on her kitchen table. She wrote the sentence on the legal pad anyway, and she put the legal pad in a drawer. And on Monday morning, she went back to work, selling fax machines. What she did over the next 2 years was strange. She didn't quit her job. She kept selling fax machines during the day. But every night after work, she went to a Barnes & Noble in Atlanta and sat in the corner of the business and reference section on the floor with patent law textbooks open in her lap. She couldn't afford a patent attorney. Patent attorneys at the time charged $3,000 to $5,000 to file a single application. So Sarah taught herself patent law on the carpet of a chain bookstore for more than a year. At one point, a security guard came over and asked her if she was all right. She said she was fine. He nodded. He saw her there several nights a week for months. He was the closest thing she had to a witness. When she had a draft of her own patent, she started calling hosiery mills in North Carolina. There were maybe a dozen of them in the country at the time, all clustered in a small geographic radius around the same handful of textile towns. She called every single one. Then she got in her car and drove up to North Carolina and showed up at the mills unannounced. She walked into them in heels and a business suit, 27 years old, with a prototype she had stitched together herself at her kitchen table. Every single mill said no. Every one of them. Some of the men laughed. Some were polite. One of them told her plainly that women had been wearing pantyhose for decades, and there was no market for what she was describing. Another one told her, in so many words, that she should go home, that nobody had asked for this, that women didn't actually want what she was describing. They only thought they did. And here is where this story would normally end. This is where most stories like this do end, with a young woman, broke, no industry experience, getting walked out of every room she tries to enter, driving back to Atlanta empty-handed, wondering what she was thinking. But 2 weeks after one of the rejections, the phone rang. The mill owner who had said no, his daughters had overheard him talking about Sarah's visit at the dinner table that week. They had asked him what the product was. He had tried to explain it. They had told him, plainly, that it was the smartest idea they had heard in years. He called Sarah back. He told her he had reconsidered. He agreed to make a sample run for her. 2,000 units, out of his own pocket. Not because he believed in the product, he said, because his daughters wouldn't stop bringing it up. Sarah Blakely now had 2,000 units of a product that did not exist anywhere else in the world. She also had no distribution, no store, no buyer, no marketing budget, not a single dollar set aside for advertising, so she did something that on paper makes no sense at all. She picked up the phone and called the corporate offices of Neiman Marcus in Dallas, cold. She got the buyer for the hosiery department on the line. She told the buyer she had a product that would change her customers' lives. The buyer agreed to give her 10 minutes. Sarah flew to Dallas. She walked into the meeting in her best black suit. She started her pitch. The buyer was distracted, polite, looking at her watch every couple of minutes. 3 minutes in, Sarah could feel the meeting slipping out from under her. So she stopped, and she said, "Will you come to the women's room with me?" And the buyer stared at her. Sarah repeated the question. The buyer, more out of curiosity than anything else, agreed. In the women's restroom of the Neiman Marcus corporate office, Sarah Blakely changed clothes, first into a pair of cream-colored slacks, without Spanx underneath, then into the same pair of slacks with Spanx underneath. She walked out of the store both times. She watched the buyer's face the second time. The buyer placed an order for 7 Neiman Marcus stores before they walked back to the office. 2 years later, 2 years, Sarah Blakely was sitting at home on a regular Tuesday afternoon when her phone rang. It was a producer from Oprah's production company. Spanx had been selected as one of Oprah's favorite things for the holiday season of the year 2000. Sarah hung up the phone. She walked into her bedroom. She opened the drawer where she had put the yellow legal pad 2 years and 4 months earlier. She read the sentence she had written at the top of the first page. "This product is going to be on Oprah's favorite things." She started to cry. In 2012, Forbes magazine named Sarah Blakely the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world. She was 41 years old. She had built a billion-dollar company, and she had never spent a single dollar on advertising. Now, hold Sarah's story in your mind for a minute, because there is something about what she did, without ever having heard of Wallace Wattles, without ever having read his 100-year-old book, that is exactly what that book says to do. Step by step, almost as if she had been handed the manual and followed it, line by line. What Wattles called the certain way wasn't a hustle. It wasn't a grind. It wasn't a 10-step morning routine. It was something stranger and quieter than that. And the first piece of it, the very first thing his book asks you to understand, is the thing Sarah Blakely got right, without ever knowing she was supposed to get it right. Wattles believed there were 2 ways a person could think about money. Not 3, not 7, 2. And he believed almost everyone in the world thought about it the wrong way, and that this single mistake was responsible for almost all of the poverty he saw around him. He called the wrong way the competitive mind, and he called the right way the creative mind. And the entire rest of his book, every page after this distinction, depends on you understanding the difference between them. So let me give it to you the way he meant it. The competitive mind looks at the world and sees a fixed pie. There is a certain amount of money. There are a certain number of customers. There are a certain number of houses, jobs, opportunities, and seats at the table. And if you want a slice of that pie, you have to take it from somebody else. That's the assumption. That's the air the competitive mind breathes. And so the competitive mind is always tense, always looking around, always checking who else is in the room, always asking, what if they get there first? The competitive mind reads the news and sees scarcity. It sees rising prices and shrinking opportunity and other people getting ahead of it. It feels underneath everything that the world is closing in. The creative mind sees something different. The creative mind sees that the pie itself is not fixed, that pies are made every single day by people who decide to make them. The creative mind doesn't ask, how do I get a slice of what already exists? The creative mind asks, what doesn't exist yet that I could bring into being? And here's what Wattles said, and what almost nobody who reads his book actually believes the first time they hear it. The people who get genuinely, durably, repeatedly rich are almost never operating from the competitive mind. They are operating from the creative one. Sarah Blakely never tried to take market share away from Hanes. She never tried to compete with the pantyhose companies that had owned the category for 50 years. She didn't go to war with anyone. She made a product that didn't exist in a category that didn't exist for a customer who didn't know she was waiting for it. She didn't take a slice of an existing pie. She baked a new pie on her kitchen table. Now think about every business book you have ever read. Think about the language, competitive advantage, capturing market share, eating your competitor's lunch, beating the competition. The entire vocabulary of the modern business world is the vocabulary of the competitive mind. We have been trained to think this way. We assume this is what business is. Wattles, in 1910, over 100 years ago, before any modern business school existed, before any of us were born, said this was the trap. He said the people who play this game can sometimes win it, but they can never relax inside it. And the wealth they get, they spend their whole lives defending. Riches secured on the competitive plane, he wrote, are never satisfactory and permanent. They are yours today and another's tomorrow. If you've ever met someone who is technically rich, but seems perpetually anxious about money, checking their portfolio every 20 minutes, hating their competitors, certain that someone is about to take from them what they have built, you've met the competitive mind in its later stages. They have the money, the mind is still poor. So the first move Wattles asks his reader to make, the very first thing, is to stop competing. Stop seeing other people as obstacles between you and what you want. Stop scanning the room for threats. Stop measuring your position relative to anyone else's. The pie is not fixed. The supply is not running out. You are not in a race against another person for the same finite thing. And then, and only then, he gets to the part that makes most modern readers stop reading. Wattles believed there is a substance underneath the visible world. He called it thinking substance, or original substance, or formless stuff. He believed it was alive. He believed it was intelligent. He believed it filled the spaces between every visible thing in the universe, the air, the matter, the empty space between stars, and that all of it was, in some way, aware. And he believed that a clear thought, held inside this substance with faith, would cause the substance to shape itself in the form of that thought, that the substance would respond to thought the way iron filings respond to a magnet, that this is, in fact, how everything in the visible universe came to be in the first place. If your skeptic is twitching right now, that's fine. Mine did too the first time I read this book. We're going to come back to that twitch in a minute, and I'm going to tell you something honest about it. But for right now, just sit with what Wattles is claiming. He is claiming that thought is not a passive thing happening inside you. He is claiming that thought is an active force radiating out from you all the time, and that the world is responding to it whether you know it or not. That you are, every single moment of every single day, transmitting something, and that the substance of the universe is receiving that signal and beginning, in small ways and large, to shape itself accordingly. You don't have to believe him. I'm not going to ask you to. Here's what I'll say instead. After 90 years of people picking up this book, doing exactly what it told them to do, and getting results, including the woman in the Melbourne bedroom we'll get back to, something is worth noticing. The practices that fall out of Wattles' metaphysics, the clear mental image, the gratitude practice, the refusal to think competitively, the action taken in your present circumstances, those practices keep producing results, regardless of whether you accept the metaphysics behind them. You can read Wattles as a mystic. You can read him as a very early behavioral psychologist, using the vocabulary of his time. You can read him as a man who stumbled onto something true and could only describe it through the language available to him in 1910. The book works either way. The people it has worked on for the last 100 years have included devout religious people, hardened skeptics, business people who never thought twice about the metaphysics, and spiritual seekers who thought about nothing else. We're not at Rhonda's bedroom yet. We're getting closer. But before we get there, there's a reason a 52-year-old milkshake machine salesman with arthritis and diabetes and a failing business ended up changing how the entire world eats. And what he did, without ever having read this book, without ever having heard the name Wallace Wattles, is the exact second move Wattles tells you to make, right after you stop competing. It's the summer of 1954. Ray Kroc is 52 years old. He lives outside Chicago. He has been selling things, door to door and territory to territory, for 35 years. He sold paper cups for the Lily Tulip Cup Company. For 17 years, he was good at it. Then he left to sell something called the multi-mixer, a machine that could make 5 milkshakes simultaneously. Soda fountains and diners across America bought them through the late 40s and early 50s. For a while, Ray was making good money. By 1954, the business was dying. Drive-in restaurants had started replacing soda fountains. The new drive-ins didn't need 5 spindle milkshake mixers. They were buying single spindle units from Hamilton Beach. Cheaper, simpler. Ray's territory was shrinking month by month. He was also physically not well. He had diabetes. He had the early arthritis that would eventually keep him from playing the piano he loved. He had already had his gallbladder out and was missing most of his thyroid. His doctor had told him to slow down. His wife wanted him to slow down. Ray Kroc, at 52, was a man with most of his life apparently behind him. The American story we tell about Ray Kroc, the brash, hungry, hard-charging founder of McDonald's, that man does not exist yet in 1954. The man who exists in 1954 is tired. He is sick. He is broke. He is selling milkshake machines into a category that is dying around him. One afternoon in his small office in Chicago, his secretary brings him an order from California. A small hamburger stand in a town called San Bernardino has ordered 8 multi-mixers. 8. Ray stares at the order form. 8 multi-mixers means a single restaurant capable of making 40 milkshakes at the same time. 40. He has never seen a single restaurant order more than 2 of these machines. Who needs 40 milkshakes simultaneously? He thinks about it for a few days. He keeps coming back to it. The order doesn't make sense. He decides to fly out and look. Just look. Just see what kind of operation needs 40 milkshakes at once. Ray Kroc lands in Los Angeles, drives the 70 miles east to San Bernardino, and pulls into the parking lot of a small octagonal building with red and white tile and 2 large arches over the roof. It's late morning. The lunch rush is just starting. He sits in his car. He watches. What he sees, he can hardly believe. There is a line. The line is around the corner of the building. People are lined up at 2 windows on the front of the building. Behind those windows, he can see, through the glass, a kind of choreography he has never seen before in any restaurant in his 35 years of selling into restaurants. Every person behind the counter is doing one thing and one thing only. One man is working the grill. One man is dressing the buns. One woman is on the fries. One woman is on the milkshakes. One man is at the register. The food comes out in seconds, not minutes. Seconds. The menu is tiny. A hamburger, a cheeseburger, French fries, milkshakes, soft drinks. That's almost the entire menu. There's no waitress. There are no tables inside. People order at the window, take their food in a paper bag, and eat it standing in the parking lot or sitting on the hoods of their cars. Ray sits in his rented car for several hours. He watches the line stay long through the entire lunch period. He watches the line stay long into the afternoon. Hundreds of people, thousands of dollars passing across that counter every hour. In $1954, at some point he gets out of the car. He walks up to the counter. He buys a hamburger. He stands in the parking lot eating it. He watches the operation from the inside out. And then he asks the man behind the counter if he can speak to the owners. The owners are two brothers, Richard and Maurice McDonald, Mac and Dick. They are quiet men, polite, plain-spoken. They invent the kind of restaurant they want to run, they make a comfortable living from it, and they have no particular interest in building an empire. Ray Kroc, sitting across from them in their small office, asks them why they don't have more locations. Mac McDonald looks at him and says, and I'm paraphrasing the actual exchange, "We already make more money than we know what to do with. Why would we want more locations? Then we'd have to manage them." Ray Kroc cannot believe what he is hearing. He has just stood in a parking lot for 3 hours watching the most efficient restaurant in human history print money, and the two men who built it have no plans to do it twice. He goes back to his hotel that night. He cannot sleep. He paces the hotel room. He picks up the telephone. He puts it down. He picks it up again. By 2 in the morning, he has decided Ray Kroc is not going to keep selling milkshake machines. Ray Kroc is going to spend the rest of his life building what the McDonald brothers refused to build. He flies back to San Bernardino the next week. He sits across from the brothers again. He tells them plainly, "I will travel the country. I will sign franchise agreements with operators. I will build this restaurant in town after town. You will collect a percentage of every dollar that passes through every location. You will not have to do any of the work." The brothers think about it. They are not enthusiastic. They are not greedy men, but they say yes, partly out of curiosity, partly because Ray's energy is hard to refuse, and they sign a deal that gives them a small royalty. Ray Kroc walks out of that meeting 52 years old, with diabetes, with arthritis, with most of his savings already spent, with a wife at home who thinks he is making the worst mistake of his life. And he begins. By 1966 years later, there are 200 McDonald's restaurants in the United States. By 1965, 11 years later, there are 700. By the time Ray Kroc dies in 1984, there are over 7,500 McDonald's restaurants in the world, and the company has fundamentally rewritten how human beings eat. Ray Kroc was not the smartest man in any room he ever walked into. He was not the youngest. He was not the healthiest. He had no advantages going in. What he had was the ability, when he saw the thing, to act on it. That day, not next month, not after he'd researched the market, not after he'd raised funding or assembled a team or written a business plan. He saw the line in the parking lot. He understood what it meant, and he acted on it inside the body and the circumstances he had, with the resources already in front of him. And that exact instinct is the second principle Wattles spends almost half of his book trying to drill into you. Act now upon the persons and things in your present environment. That's almost the exact line from the book. Wattles is hammering it. He says it differently in 5 or 6 different chapters, but the spine of it never changes. You cannot act in the past. The past is gone. You cannot act in the future because the future does not exist yet. You can only act in the place where you are, with the resources you have, on the people and circumstances directly in front of you, right now, today. And he's not being poetic about this. He is being almost ruthlessly literal. He says, in plain language, that if you are sitting around waiting for the right opportunity to come along, the right job, the right city, the right amount of capital, the right partner, You are not in the certain way yet. You are still on the wrong side of it. Because the people who actually get rich, Wattles claims, and Ray Kroc demonstrates, they don't wait for better circumstances. They use the circumstances they have as the means of getting to better ones. Ray Kroc didn't wait until he was healthy. He didn't wait until he had savings. He didn't wait until he had the right partners. He acted in the body of a sick 52-year-old with a dying milkshake mixer business in a hotel room in California on a Tuesday in 1954. If he had waited for better circumstances, he would have died selling milkshake machines. And there's a second piece to this, a piece almost nobody who reads Wattles for the first time really registers, because it sounds like a moral lesson when actually it's a mechanical instruction. He says, every transaction you participate in must give the other person more in use value than you take from them in cash value. He gives a strange example in the book itself, a sort of half-imagined scene about going to the Arctic and trading a painting to an Inuit man for $500 worth of furs. Wattles points out that the painting is worth a lot of money to an art collector in New York, but to the Inuit man, the painting is worthless. It will not feed him. It will not clothe him. It will not shelter him. So Wattles writes, and this is one of his sharpest lines in the whole book, I have wronged him. Even if the cash values balance, the use values do not. But, Wattles says, suppose instead I trade the same Inuit man a rifle worth $50 for the $500 in furs. The cash values now look completely lopsided. Wattles is taking 10 times more cash value than he is giving, but the use value the man receives, a tool that will let him hunt more food, feed his family more reliably, survive the winter, is enormous. That trade, Wattles says, is honest. That trade leaves the world richer than it found it. Now sit with that for a minute. Because once you start looking at the world through this lens, it changes how you read almost every business interaction you have ever participated in. How much of what you bought in the last year actually delivered more use value into your life than the cash value you paid? How much of what you sold, your time, your labor, your products, your services, left the people who paid you genuinely better off? Wattles' claim is that the people who get reliably rich over long stretches of time are almost always the ones who are obsessively focused on this asymmetry. They are adding more life to the world than they are extracting from it. The customer leaves richer than the customer arrived. The employee leaves richer than the employee arrived. The supplier leaves richer than the supplier arrived. Every transaction in Wattles' framework should be a small act of creation, not a small act of extraction. Ray Kroc, in the early years of McDonald's, was almost neurotically obsessed with this. He paid his early franchisees more generously than the industry standard because he understood that if his operators didn't get rich, he couldn't get rich. He set up his royalty structure so that an operator who worked hard could become a multimillionaire on a single store. The customer got a hamburger of consistent quality in a clean restaurant in under a minute at a price they could afford. The supplier got long-term, predictable, enormous orders. Everybody who touched the system got more out of it than they put in. That is not a moral position. That is a mechanical one. That is the engine. Wattles thought it was the engine in 1910. McDonald's accidentally proved he was right in 1964. And every time you watch a business that seems to be extracting more than it's giving, squeezing employees, deceiving customers, cutting corners on suppliers, you are watching in real time a business that is going to have a much harder time staying rich than the casual observer thinks. The competitive mind always assumes the squeezing is the strategy. Wattles thought the squeezing was the symptom, the sign that the business had already lost its grip on the creative plane and was now playing defense for the rest of its life. Now, if you're still with me, I want to tell you about the part of this book most people skip, the part that sounds soft until you realize it's the actual mechanism. The part that, if you described it to a hard-nosed business person at a dinner party, they would look at you like you'd lost your mind. Wattles devotes an entire chapter to gratitude, and not in the way you'd expect, not as a virtue, not as a wellness practice, not as something you do because it's nice or because it makes you a better person. He calls gratitude the active connection, the mechanism, the thing that when present allows the rest of the system to work, and that when absent causes the whole thing to break down no matter how hard you push on the other parts. He says, and I'll paraphrase, that you can have the clearest mental picture of what you want. You can do the work. You can act in the present. You can refuse to compete. And if you do all of those things without gratitude, you will not get what you want. The wires will not connect. The current will not flow. Now in 1910, when Wattles wrote that, almost nobody in business or psychology took the claim seriously. Gratitude was a Sunday word. It belonged in churches. It had no place in a book about how to get rich. But here's what's strange. In the last 20 years, behavioral psychology has produced study after study showing something Wattles couldn't have proved in 1910, but seems to have intuited anyway. People who keep a daily gratitude practice, even a simple one, even just writing down 3 things they're grateful for every morning, show measurable changes in their decision-making, their willingness to take risks, their ability to recognize opportunities, and their tolerance for short-term discomfort in pursuit of long-term goals. The gratitude isn't separate from the success. The gratitude is training the brain that produces the success. Wattles in 1910 said this in language that sounds almost theological. He said gratitude unifies the mind with the intelligence of substance. Strip away the metaphysics and you get something almost identical to what neuroscience now says about attention. What you fix your attention on, you become. What you stare at long enough begins to fill the inside of your mind, and the inside of your mind shapes how you read every situation that walks through your life. If you spend your day fixed on lack, on what you don't have, on what other people have that you don't, on what you should have had by now, then your brain is training itself to perceive the world that way. Every situation you walk into, you will scan for evidence of lack. You will notice the missing thing first. You will compare what's there to what's not there, and feel the not there as the louder of the two. If you spend your day fixed on what you actually have, on the warm room, on the working body, on the people who love you, on the small things that worked out today, your brain trains itself the other direction. You start scanning the world for evidence of abundance. Opportunities you would have walked past, you start to see. People you would have dismissed, you start to listen to. The world literally looks different to a grateful person than to an ungrateful one. Not because the world is different, because the perceptual apparatus is different. And this is where the boy at the piano comes in. Wattles tells one short story in his entire book. One. The book is over 100 pages long, and he tells exactly one human story, and he tells it in a few paragraphs. He says, and I'm telling it the way he tells it. I once saw a small boy sitting at a piano. The boy was trying to play. His hands were too small. He was hitting wrong keys. He was getting frustrated, getting upset, almost crying. Wattles asked the boy what was wrong. The boy said, I can feel the music in me, but I can't make my hands go right. Wattles never forgot that line. He held on to it. He believed that what the boy had said about the piano was true about almost everything human beings desperately want and don't have yet. The desire itself is the proof that the capacity is there. We can feel the music in us. We just can't yet make our hands go right. And gratitude, in Wattles' reading, is what closes the gap between the music inside you and the hands that have to play it. Not because gratitude is magic, because gratitude fixes attention, and fixed attention held long enough becomes a force that organizes everything around it. You start being grateful for what you have. Your attention shifts. Your perception shifts. Opportunities you would not have seen, you see. Conversations you would not have had, you have. Decisions you would not have made, you make. And 6 months later, 12 months later, 3 years later, you find yourself somewhere you could not have reached by force. We're almost back to Rhonda's bedroom. She had been crying for most of that year. Her father, who she had loved more than almost anyone in her life, had just died. Sudden, unexpected, in his sleep. Her television production company in Australia, the one she had built, was financially collapsing. Her relationship was ending. Her relationship with her oldest daughter was strained almost to the breaking point. She owed money she could not pay back. Her doctor had put her on antidepressants and told her gently that things would feel different in time. One afternoon, and Rhonda has told this story herself in interviews and in writing, so I'm not inventing any of it. Her daughter Haley came home, sat down on the edge of her mother's bed, and put a small yellowed paperback into her hands. "Read this, Mum." Rhonda did not want to read it. She wanted to sleep. She wanted the day to be over. But her daughter sat there, and Rhonda, mostly to make her daughter feel better, opened the book. What happened over the next several hours, and what she did over the next several years, the part of her story almost nobody tells, is what we're about to see. The book Haley put in her mother's hands that afternoon was The Science of Getting Rich, the same 100-page paperback Wattles had finished writing 94 years earlier. The same book Napoleon Hill had read, the same book Earl Nightingale had read, the same book that had quietly passed from hand to hand for almost a century without ever becoming famous. Rhonda read it that afternoon. She read it that evening. She did not put it down. By the time she finished it for the first time, she has said the room was dark and she had not turned on a light. What struck her, and what she has talked about in interviews more than any other piece of her own story, was not the metaphysics. It was not the thinking substance, or the formless, or the philosophical scaffolding. What struck her was something much simpler and much more uncomfortable. She realized that she had been doing almost everything in her life from the competitive mind. She had been comparing her life to other people's. She had been measuring success against external benchmarks. She had been afraid almost every day that other people were getting ahead of her. She had been thinking about money the way a person thinks about a finite resource that someone else might take. And she had been, and this was the line that hit her hardest, almost completely without gratitude. For years, her father had died. Her business was collapsing. Her relationships were strained. And she sat on her bed that night in the dark and realized that she had not, for a very long time, sat down and felt grateful for anything in her life. She did something that night that sounds small. She has described it in her own words, and I'll paraphrase. She got out of bed. She walked to her kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water, and she stood at her kitchen sink and started writing down, on a piece of paper she pulled out of a drawer, the things in her life she was grateful for. Her daughters, the roof over her head, the fact that the heater in her apartment was working, the fact that she still had legs that walked, eyes that read, hands that wrote, the friend who had texted her that morning to check in, the fact that she had been able to feed herself a meal that day. Small things, almost embarrassingly small things. She filled the page. She got out a second piece of paper. She filled that one too. She did this every day for the next several months. Not because she felt better. She didn't, not at first. She did it because the book had said to. And she had decided, and this is what almost nobody in her position would have decided, that she was going to do exactly what the book said, without arguing with it, without editing it, without modifying it for her own circumstances. Whatever the book said to do, she would do. She began holding a clear mental image of what she wanted. She had read Wattles' instruction to be specific, to know what you actually want, in detail, the way a sailor knows the port he's sailing toward. So she sat with herself and she thought about what she actually wanted. Not vague, not aspirational, specifically. What she wanted, she realized, was to make a film. A film that would do for other people what this book was doing for her. A film that would take the principles inside this strange little 100-year-old paperback and put them into the language of the 21st century, so that other women sitting in their own bedrooms in their own worst years could have what she had just been handed. She had no money to make a film. She had no production company that wasn't financially failing. She had no investors. She had no script. She had no team. What she had the day she started was the same thing Sarah Blakely had had on her kitchen table in Atlanta in 1998. A clear mental image, a piece of paper, and the willingness to act on what was already in front of her. She started small. She started with what she had. She made phone calls. She talked to people. She read more books. Wattles led her to Hill. Hill led her to a dozen others, all the way back to ancient texts that said almost the same thing. She started compiling. She started writing. She started reaching out to teachers and authors and speakers who had built careers on these same ideas without ever crediting Wattles for them. One by one, people said yes. A speaker she had not expected to reach agreed to be interviewed. Then another. Then another. By the end of 2005, she had filmed dozens of interviews with some of the most well-known self-help and personal development figures in the world, many of whom traced their own ideas back to either Wattles directly or to Hill, who had built on Wattles. The film was released in March of 2006. It was called The Secret. It was on the surface a film about something Rhonda was calling the law of attraction, but the actual content of the film, the practices it taught, the framework it presented, was almost a direct dramatization of Wallace Wattles' 100-page book. Clear mental image, faith, gratitude, action, refuse the competitive mind, hold the picture, act on what's in front of you. The film became one of the highest-grossing self-help products in history. The book that followed it, also called The Secret, sold over 30 million copies. Time magazine put Rhonda Byrne on the list of the 100 most influential people in the world. Oprah Winfrey devoted 2 consecutive episodes of her show to the film. The combined revenue of the franchise crossed $300 million. But here is what almost nobody who watched The Secret in 2006 knew. In the front matter of The Secret, both the film and the book, Rhonda Byrne names her source. She tells you plainly that what set her on this path was a 100-page paperback called The Science of Getting Rich, written by a man named Wallace Wattles. She does not hide it. She does not soften it. She does not pretend the ideas are her own. She tells anyone who is paying attention exactly where they came from. And then she did something else. She made The Science of Getting Rich available free as a downloadable PDF on her website. Anybody who wanted to read the book that had changed her life could download it for nothing. The book that had been sitting on shelves in obscurity for 90 years started, suddenly, to be downloaded by tens of thousands of people, then hundreds of thousands, then millions. The book Wallace Wattles had finished in 1910, that he had died believing might matter someday, was, by 2007, being read by more people in a single year than had read it in the entire 90 years between his death and Rhonda Byrne's afternoon on the floor of her bedroom. Now I want to take you somewhere. In a small cemetery in Elwood, Indiana, there is a stone. It is not large. It is not ornate. It does not say anything about what the man buried under it accomplished, because at the time he was buried, he had not yet accomplished anything that the world had noticed. The stone says his name and the years he lived, and not much else. Wallace the 500th, Wattles, 1860 to 1911. He died on February 7th, 1911. He was 51 years old. The cause of death was tuberculosis, which he had likely had for some time and which had been steadily wearing him down through the year he wrote his book. He died in Ruskin, Tennessee, where he had moved to try to recover his health, and his body was returned to Indiana for burial. The funeral was small. His wife Abby and his daughter Florence were present, a few friends. The town's clergyman read a passage It was over within an hour. Wallace Wattles never knew that Napoleon Hill would read his book and build Think and Grow Rich on its foundation. He never knew that Earl Nightingale would record The Strangest Secret and that millions of people would hear it. He never knew that 93 years after his death, a woman in Australia would pick up his book in the worst week of her life and turn it into the largest self-help phenomenon of the 21st century. He never knew that by 2025, the practices he had described in 1910 would be discussed in business schools, in psychology departments, in books read by hundreds of millions of people. He died believing it would matter, with no evidence. He had finished the book. He had paid to have it printed. He had sold a few hundred copies through small mail order ads, and then he had gotten on a train to Tennessee, hoping the warmer climate would help his lungs. It didn't. He died 14 months after the book came out. He never saw what the book did. And here's the thing that, when I sat with this whole story for long enough, finally landed for me. The book is itself the proof of the book. Wattles wrote a 100-page manual claiming that a clear thought, held with faith and gratitude over time, would shape the world around it. Slowly, sometimes invisibly, but reliably, he wrote that book, held that thought, died, and the thought did exactly what he said it would do. It traveled, it moved through Hill, it moved through Nightingale, it moved through dozens of others who built on it without naming him. It sat on shelves for 90 years, dormant, waiting. And then, in a Melbourne bedroom in 2004, the thought met a woman who was willing to do exactly what it said, and it took the form she gave it, and through her it reached more people than Wattles, in his most hopeful imagining, could ever have pictured reaching. That is not metaphor. That is the actual sequence of events. That is what happened. You can read Wattles as a mystic and say the thinking substance moved his thought through 90 years of history toward Rhonda Byrne. You can read him as a sharp early observer of how human attention shapes human action, and say that he stumbled onto a real psychological mechanism and described it in the only vocabulary he had. You can read him as a hopeful man who got lucky, but the book describes a process, and the book underwent that process, and the process produced exactly the result the book predicted it would produce. The genuine question I want to leave you with, and it's not a clever question, it's just an honest one, is the question Rhonda Byrne sat with in her kitchen on the night her daughter handed her the book. What would change in your life if you stopped arguing with this book? If you stopped needing to figure out whether the metaphysics was real or fake? Whether Wattles was a mystic or a psychologist, whether you believe in thinking substance or you don't, and just did exactly what the book says to do for 90 days? Not as a believer, not as a convert, not as a person who has decided the universe is alive and listening, just as somebody willing to run the experiment, build the clear mental image, hold it daily, feel grateful for what you actually have, in writing every morning. Refuse to compete. Act now where you are with what you have. Give every person you transact with more in use value than you take from them in cash value. Do what the book says every day for 90 days and see what happens, because that experiment is what Sarah Blakely ran without knowing she was running it. It's what Ray Kroc ran without knowing he was running it. It's what Rhonda Byrne ran on purpose. And it's what Wallace Wattles, dying of tuberculosis in Tennessee in early 1911, ran on a book he wasn't sure anyone would ever read. The Science of Getting Rich is in the public domain. You can read it for free. The text I worked from is freely available online, and Rhonda Byrne herself made it available on her website years ago. But if you want a physical copy on your shelf, and after sitting with it for as long as I have, I think a physical copy is worth having. Links to Amazon and Audible are in the description below. If you found this useful, the best thing you can do is subscribe. There are more videos on this channel about the books that have shaped how human beings have tried to live well. Books like this one, books that don't get read often enough, books that when you actually sit down with them, do something to you. One last thing. If you're sitting somewhere right now in a hard year of your own, if your father just died, or your business is failing, or your relationships are coming apart, or you're flat broke, or you're 45 years old, and the life you thought you'd be living by now is not the life you're living, I want you to hear something Wattles believed, and that I have come to believe too. The desire you feel for a different life is not a defect. It is not something to be ashamed of. It is not greed, and it is not selfishness. It is, in Wattles' words, the music in you looking for hands that can play it. The fact that you can feel it at all is the proof that the capacity is there. You just have not yet, today, made your hands go right, but you can. And the book that sat on shelves for 90 years before it found Rhonda Byrne, the book a dying man in Indiana wrote in the last full year of his life, is still here, still doing what it does, and still waiting for the people who are ready to do exactly what it says. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.